So here we are with our seed starting lab. So I've got my ingredients, which is some of your soil mix. This is way more than you'll need. You're gonna need just enough to fill your 6-pack. The second thing you'll need is one of your 6-packs. You're gonna need some water to moisten your mix, so I have a little bucket of it, but you can use a hose or your kitchen sink, whatever works. Next thing you're gonna need is some seeds. I'd like you to grab the lettuce and tomatoes if you have them. If you have something different, grab the next closest thing. You're gonna need one of your labels and then a pencil. A pencil actually works better than a pen. It also works better than a Sharpie for writing on these labels. If you don't have a pencil, grab a Sharpie or whatever you have. So we need to moisten the seed starting mix. So we want it to have the feeling of a damp sponge. Basically, a lot of soil mix is pretty hydrophobic, so if you don't wet it first and then you wait till you sow your seeds to water it, it might not take up the water quite as nicely, so you want it to be a little moist. All right, you're gonna then fill your seed tray. And you're gonna put it aside for a second. All right, so we're then gonna look at the seeds we're sowing. You know what, a pro tip might be to do your labeling first, because otherwise you have these dirty hands. So the easier seed to work with is gonna be lettuce. Tomatoes, as I'll probably read on the back here, but I'll just tell you, tomatoes really germinate better and more quickly if they have a lot of heat. So, lettuce just doesn't need as much heat to germinate. It's just kind of an easier seed to start. So for this lab, we're all gonna do lettuce or a similar easy green. For those of you who want to try kind of the next level, or you've done this before, or you have a heat mat or some other kind of greenhouse set up already, why don't you go ahead and also sow a 6-pack of tomatoes? So anyone who wants to can do both, but everyone will at least do the lettuce. So I encourage everyone to read the back of the seed packet. Some companies do a better job than others at giving us information, but you'll see this tells us a lot about lettuce. We want to sow it about a 1/4 inch deep. We want to thin it to 8 inches in field spacing. We need full sun, as most of us know, for tomatoes. But a lot of seed companies will go further and give us even more information than this. They'll say exactly what temperature is needed for germination. Of course, we don't always have those conditions, but we can try to approximate them. And it will tell us, let's see, this tells us when the seed was packed, 2019. It'll also tell us the germination rate. So we're gonna make our labels. So we're gonna write the date on top, and then the Latin name for the crop, which isn't always on the seed packet. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine when it's not on the seed packet. You can Google it if you don't know it. I happen to know that this is Lactuca sativa, one of those words you never pronounce out loud, you just write it, so hopefully that's how you pronounce it. So the Latin name on top, which is a capital first word and a lowercase second word, so the genus, species. We're gonna then write the common name for the crop and the variety, so lettuce, giant, Caesar. Sometimes we can even write the seed company, so I would do a B for Burpee, and there we have it. So, I'm gonna get my 6-pack ready. I'm first going to open the seed packet and take a look at the size of the seeds, just to see what I'm gonna be working with here. Seeds are gonna be all different sizes and shapes. Probably gonna have way more than you need, yep. So the rule of thumb is to bury a seed about twice as deep as it is big. I usually go with about twice as big as it is wide. So this means you're going to go back into your soil and make little indents for about how big the seeds are. So these are tiny, so I'm just going to make little impressions there that these seeds are going to sit in. It'll help them to be buried, and it will help them to not wash away. If you were sowing those beans from last week, for example, which you're welcome to do now, if you haven't already, you're also welcome to compost them. If we were to sow those, we would need slightly bigger holes. If we were sowing really tiny seeds, such as like a snapdragon, you would hardly want any impression at all. In addition, some more advanced seeds need really specific light requirements to germinate. So some seed packets might say need light to germinate or need complete darkness to germinate. Most seeds that we'll work with are somewhere in the middle. But if something needed light to germinate, you would sow it on the very surface of the soil, and then you wouldn't cover it. We're going to be, in fact, covering these seeds. So on the other end of the spectrum, if we were sowing something that needed more darkness, Chinese forget-me-nots, which is a flower I love, it's also known as cineglossum, they need complete darkness. So I would do this process, and then I would wrap it in black plastic and probably stick it under a bench. So now that I have made my impressions, I'm going to sow about 2 to 3 seeds per cell. It's okay if they're kind of right next to each other. It's better if they're not on top of each other. And it's best to just put a few in your finger and kind of pinch them out. If you end up sowing 2, that's fine. If you end up sowing 4, that's totally fine also. I think you guys know enough now to think about some reasons why you might want to sow more seeds. So if we know that there's a bad germination rate, if we know the seeds are really old, you might want to sow more. You're welcome to sow these seeds in your garden or give them away, the extras. But it's probably best to hold on to a few in case you need to redo this experiment for any reason. We're then going to go cover the seeds. You can do this a number of ways. You can grab what I just did. You can also grab a little handful of soil and cover it. When you're done, you want the soil level to be pretty flush with the top of the tray. So I might even add a little bit more. Some people cover seeds with vermiculite instead of with soil mix. I've started to do this on a lot of my seeds because it just helps the environment stay a little bit more moist. We then need to water in this transplant. So why don't you take a look at this tomato packet as I grab the hose. All right, we see here that we are working out of the greenhouse, so you're making do with what you have at home, such as a hose that isn't quite where you thought it was. I'm going to show you a few different settings for this hose because a lot of garden hoses are like this. So this is kind of a good average spray for what I use on a lot of my more mature transplants. When I first sow seeds, I want something a bit more gentle. So some fancier wands have a even gentler setting. This doesn't quite have the right thing, but what it does have is a mist setting. So I'm going to use the mist setting. I'm going to water and then I'm going to wait a second in order to let all the water soak in. The more moist soil is, the better it will take up water, much like a sponge. So if I had watered too much at the beginning, it might just run off of the top, which might cause the seeds to run off as well. We'll learn more about watering throughout this course, but if we had a lot of trays to water, I always think of the four corners and the kind of the edges. The middle of the trays always get watered enough. The corners and the edges, it's often tricky, so you want to make sure that you're going kind of above and beyond things to get everything up. We would like to see this soaking through the bottom of the tray, so you can make sure that that's happening and keep watering until it's happens. Some people start out with a little bit less water. I like to get thoroughly soaked first. We are then going to stick our label in here, and you're going to put this in the warmest place you have. So for some of you that will be a heat mat or a greenhouse. For some of you that will be the top of the fridge. You'll see in your instructions that I suggest checking in on it multiple times a day. I know that's not always possible. It's probably going to need water once or twice a day. And when you can see that about 50% of the surface of the soil has dried down, that's ideally when you would water again. That's a rule of thumb for seeds that have yet to germinate or seeds that have just germinated. As the seedlings get bigger, you want deeper waterings, but more infrequent. But for now, it's going to be once, twice, 3 times a day, covering the soil surface. And if you are headed out for the whole day, it might be a good idea to kind of water a little bit more heavily if possible. If you are leaving for 2 days, I would suggest possibly taking it out of the warm spot and putting it in a little bit of a cooler and darker spot. You don't need to water quite as heavily with the subsequent waterings. And that is it. Thanks for watching.